Join me as I take on the challenge of spending a whole night alone in this haunted place. Can I survive the creepiest hours? I'm standing outside the infamous Ravenwood Mansion, a place notorious for its dark history and unexplained occurrences. Built in the 1800s, this mansion has been the site of numerous mysterious deaths, and people claim to have seen the ghost of its former owner, Malcolm Ravenwood, roaming the halls. Many have attempted to stay here overnight, but few have succeeded. The eerie atmosphere and unexplained noises have driven even the bravest of souls out of this place. I've always been drawn to the supernatural and the unknown, and I've decided to take on the ultimate challenge: spend an entire night alone in Ravenwood Mansion. I've heard the stories, I've seen the videos, but I've always wondered, is it really haunted? As I stand here, looking up at the mansion, I have to admit, I'm getting a little nervous. What if I encounter something I can't explain? What if I'm not alone in this mansion? I've been preparing myself for weeks, researching the history of the mansion, reading up on the paranormal activity that's been reported here. I've got my equipment ready, my cameras, my audio recorders, everything I need to capture evidence of the supernatural. But despite all my preparations, I'm still scared. I'm still wondering if I'm doing the right thing. What if something goes wrong? What if I get hurt? As I step inside the mansion, I can feel the weight of its history bearing down on me. The air inside is thick with the scent of decay and rot. I can hear the creaks and groans of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet. I'm trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it's hard to ignore the sense of being watched. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there's no one. As I made my way through the abandoned halls, I stumbled upon a room that seemed untouched for decades. The furniture was old, dusty, and covered in cobwebs. I could almost hear the whispers of the past, the echoes of footsteps long gone. I set up my equipment, trying to capture some evidence of the paranormal activity that's been reported here. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a presence around me. It was as if someone was circling me, watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. At around 2 a.m., I heard a strange noise coming from the floor above me. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or the house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I slowly made my way upstairs, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The most terrifying moment of the night was when I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of one of the bedrooms. It was tall, imposing, and seemed to be staring straight at me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. I just stood there, frozen in terror, as the figure slowly vanished into thin air. I didn't need any more convincing, I knew that Ravenwood Mansion was haunted. Looking back on the experience, I have to admit it was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. But it was also a night of discovery, a night that made me realize that there's so much more to this world than what we can see and touch. I faced my fears, and I came out on top. I survived the night in Ravenwood Mansion, and I'll never forget the lessons I learned in those creepy hours. What do you guys think about ghosts and haunted places? Have you ever had a paranormal experience? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more adventure videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Part 1, The Descent begins. As I stood outside Ravenwood Mansion, the full weight of my decision hit me harder than I expected. The sprawling, decayed structure loomed against the night sky, its silhouette sharp and menacing, like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast. It was late October, the wind howling through the barren trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something foul, like the sourness of old blood. I felt an odd tightness in my chest, a sensation I couldn't quite explain. Was it excitement or dread? I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. This place had been calling to me for years. I had heard the stories about the tragic deaths, the disappearances, the whispers of Malcolm Ravenwood's spirit stalking the corridors. All part of the mansion's cursed history. But despite the warnings, the dark rumors, something inside me had always been irresistibly drawn here. "Tonight's the night," I whispered to myself, as if saying it out loud would make it more bearable. My footsteps crunched on the gravel pathway leading to the grand entrance, the mansion's broken windows watching me like hollow, lifeless eyes. Every step felt heavier than the last, the cold seeping into my bones despite the layers I wore. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. Nothing but shadows and swaying branches. I reached for the rusted door handle, hesitating as my fingers brushed against the cold metal. Stories of past visitors rang in my mind, how they'd fled in the middle of the night, their faces twisted in terror, unwilling or unable to describe what they had encountered inside. But I was different, wasn't I? I'd prepared, researched every inch of Ravenwood's grim history, packed my gear, and convinced myself I'd be the one to break the cycle. I had to be. With a sharp twist, I pushed open the door, the sound of ancient hinges groaning through the still night. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating, like it hadn't moved in decades. Dust hung heavy in the air, swirling in the beam of my flashlight as I stepped inside, crossing the threshold that would forever change me. The entrance hall was vast, once grand, now decaying like the carcass of a forgotten beast. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as if they might give way at any moment. A large, ornate mirror hung crooked above the staircase, its surface clouded with grime and streaked with something darker. For a moment, I caught my reflection, or what I thought was my reflection. But the figure in the glass, its eyes were too dark, too deep. I looked away quickly, chalking it up to nerves. With each step deeper into the mansion, I felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the creaking floorboards or the oppressive atmosphere, it was the distinct sensation that I was being watched. I brushed it off at first, just the house playing tricks on me. But then, something shifted. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and the faint scent of rot intensified, as if something was nearby, decaying. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around myself. As I made my way down the central hallway, I began setting up my equipment. Cameras, audio recorders, everything I needed to capture evidence of the paranormal. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. The night was still young, and I had hours to go. I decided to start in the room most notorious for its hauntings, Malcolm Ravenwood's study. The door to the study was massive, its wood darkened with age, covered in deep scratches that looked like they'd been gouged by fingernails, or claws. I hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. The room was disturbingly pristine compared to the rest of the mansion. Dust coated the floor, sure, but the furniture, the bookshelves, the desk, it was as though they had been preserved in time. A faint, acrid smell lingered in the air, something metallic, like rust or blood. I placed an audio recorder on the desk and sat in the high-backed chair that had once belonged to Ravenwood himself. For a moment, I imagined him sitting here, scrawling his last, maddened thoughts as his empire crumbled around him. Legend had it that he had gone insane before his death, convinced the mansion was cursed, haunted by something far older and far darker than any human soul. A sudden creak echoed behind me, like footsteps dragging across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the gaping doorway and the dark hallway beyond. But I knew I had heard something. The floor creaked again, and this time, the air seemed to ripple with a barely there whisper. "Get out." I froze, the words barely audible, like a breath against my ear. My blood ran cold, and every hair on my body stood on end. Had I really heard that? Or was the isolation starting to mess with my mind? Before I could process, my flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My breath quickened, panic bubbling up inside me. I fumbled for my spare flashlight, hands trembling, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. When I clicked the backup light on, its dim glow barely penetrated the thick darkness. I was no longer alone. Something moved in the corner of the room, just out of the beam's reach, a shape, tall and grotesque, swaying like a figure in a noose. My mouth went dry, and a heavy silence filled the room, thick with the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. My flashlight began to dim again, and for the briefest second, I saw it, a face, twisted and gaunt, hovering just above my own. Its lips parted in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, the chair clattering to the floor, my flashlight flickering back to life as the shape dissolved into nothing. My breath came in ragged gasps. I had come here for proof, but now that I was seeing it, all I wanted was to leave. But something was pulling me deeper into the mansion, urging me to continue, like a dark thread wound around my heart, drawing me closer to something unimaginable. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Part 2, The Tapestry of Whispers. I stood frozen, the weight of what I had just witnessed clinging to my skin like frost. My legs begged me to run, to flee the mansion and its suffocating presence, but my mind, against all logic, pushed me to stay. That face, whatever it was, had been no trick of the light. No hallucination. It was real. And it wasn't going to let me leave without showing me more. I forced myself to step forward, to breathe. The study felt colder now, the air pressing in on me from all sides, thick and suffocating. I kept my flashlight fixed on the doorway, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows beyond, but there was nothing, just the echo of my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced at the audio recorder on the desk. It was still running, the small red light blinking steadily. That meant something had been captured, right? I told myself I'd review it later, assuming I survived the night. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I gathered my equipment and moved toward the door, the floor creaking beneath me like it was groaning under the weight of something far heavier than just my footsteps. I stepped into the hallway again, and immediately felt the shift. The temperature plummeted. The walls, once just decaying plaster and wood, now seemed to breathe with an eerie, slow rhythm, like they were alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The sound of soft whispers began to drift around me, just at the edge of hearing, like a conversation happening through thick fog. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, it felt wrong. Mocking, sinister, like laughter hidden beneath the surface. I had read about the Whispering Hall, a long corridor said to drive visitors mad with disembodied voices. Many had reported hearing their own names whispered in the dark, taunting them, beckoning them to delve deeper into the mansion. I clenched my jaw and pressed on, the beam of my flashlight jittering across the walls as my hands trembled. The mansion felt like it was playing with me, guiding me like a puppet toward something, some revelation that would shatter me if I saw it too soon. Ahead, the hall opened into a large, grand room. I stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards beneath me sighing as if relieved by my presence. The room was a ballroom, or what was left of one. The ceiling soared high above, with grand chandeliers hanging by rusted chains, their crystals dulled with age and neglect. Old tapestries lined the walls, depicting scenes of a time long past, elaborate parties, masked figures dancing, their faces all turned away as though hiding some terrible secret. But it wasn't the tapestries that caught my attention. No, it was the giant crack in the floor, a jagged tear that split the room in half, like the mansion itself had been wounded. My flashlight revealed something strange within the crack, something moving. I stepped closer, my heart beating harder with every step, the beam of light shaking as I tried to focus. As I neared the edge of the chasm, I realized what I was seeing: rats. Dozens of them, scurrying through the gap, their tiny eyes reflecting my light. But they weren't behaving like normal rats. They moved in perfect synchronization, swarming up and down the walls of the crack in strange, almost geometric patterns. I took a step back, disgust twisting my stomach, when a sound behind me made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Deliberate, slow, heavy. Someone, or something, was walking toward me from the hall I had just come from. I turned, shining my light into the hallway. Nothing. The beam stretched into the darkness, illuminating nothing but the peeling wallpaper and cracked floors. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I stumbled backward, my feet scraping against the floor, the rats beneath me suddenly scattering as if something far worse was coming. I pointed my flashlight at the ballroom's entrance, breathing hard, waiting for whatever was approaching. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, an unnatural void that made my ears ring. I stood there, poised on the edge of panic, when a soft, raspy voice broke through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a low whisper, but the words echoed in my skull like a scream. My skin crawled, my muscles tensed. I whipped my flashlight around, searching for the source. Then, in the far corner of the ballroom, I saw it. A figure. Barely visible, almost blending into the darkness, like a shadow more than a man. It was tall, its body unnaturally elongated, limbs too long and thin. Its face, or where a face should be, was a blur, a smudge of darkness with hollow indentations where eyes might have been. The figure didn't move. It just watched. The room seemed to darken around it, the temperature plummeting further as the oppressive weight of its gaze pressed down on me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a reminder that I was still alive, for now. Slowly, the figure's head tilted, like it was examining me, assessing whether I was worth something. A twisted smile seemed to stretch across the blur of its face, though I couldn't be sure. And then it moved. In an instant, the figure darted toward me, faster than I thought possible. My body reacted before my mind did. I turned and ran. My feet pounded across the ballroom floor, and I could hear it behind me, its distorted limbs scraping against the ground as it pursued me. The walls blurred as I sprinted through the hallway, the whispers around me swelling into a cacophony of voices, all hissing my name, urging me to stop, to give in. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I reached the staircase at the end of the hall and threw myself down it, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting, terrifying shadows as I descended, but I didn't dare stop. The figure's presence loomed behind me, growing stronger, more oppressive with each passing second. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I couldn't afford to slow down. I stumbled into the foyer, gasping for breath, my flashlight sputtering as I frantically scanned the room for an exit. The front door was still shut, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, stifling, and the room seemed smaller than before, like the walls were closing in on me. I reached for the door, my hands shaking, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, coming from the grand staircase behind me. I turned, and there it was, at the top of the stairs. The figure. Only now, it wasn't alone. More shapes, shadowy and indistinct, emerged from the darkness, filling the stairwell like a tide of living shadows. They stood there, motionless, staring down at me with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce my very soul. One by one, they began to descend the stairs, their movements slow, deliberate. There was no rush. They knew I had nowhere to go. I backed away, my hand fumbling for the door handle. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, more urgent, like a chant, rising and falling in a pattern I couldn't understand. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for a plan, an escape. But deep down, I knew it. The house wasn't going to let me go. Not without a fight. As the shadows reached the base of the stairs, I turned the handle and threw open the door, only to be met with a wall of blackness. The outside world was gone, swallowed by the same darkness that had birthed the figures inside. It pressed against the doorframe like a living thing, pulsing, waiting for me to step through. I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving. Trapped. The figures were closing in, their footsteps soft, methodical, like they were savoring the moment. My flashlight flickered once more, and then, with a final sputter, it died. And I was plunged into total darkness. Part 3, The Ravenwood Pact. The darkness swallowed me whole, a thick, oppressive void that seemed to pulse and writhe, suffocating the air in my lungs. I stood frozen, listening to the silence grow heavier, waiting for the inevitable, the moment the shadows would claim me. My fingers clenched the flashlight uselessly, its dead weight a reminder of how ill-prepared I truly was. The whispers in the walls rose to a fevered pitch, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to scream inside my skull. They wanted me to break. I staggered backward, searching for any shred of light, any glimmer of hope. My foot caught on something, a loose floorboard or broken tile, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the cold, rotting wood. Pain shot up my leg, but the fear dulled it, sharpening every nerve, every instinct. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes adjusting slightly to the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. The figures at the base of the stairs were still there, watching, waiting. They hadn't moved since I'd slammed the door shut. But their presence, it weighed down on me, like 1,000 eyes boring into my soul. Slowly, they began to shift, their heads tilting in unison, as though they were listening to something only they could hear. And then I heard it too. A slow, deliberate knocking, echoing through the mansion. Thud. 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 It came from deep within the house, a sound too rhythmic, too intentional to be part of the natural creaks and groans of the decaying structure. The shadows on the stairs didn't react, but I could feel something shift in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of dread tightening around me. The knocking continued, steady and methodical, drawing closer. I forced myself to move, limping slightly as I retreated further into the foyer. My only thought was to escape, to find a way out of this living nightmare before it was too late. But Ravenwood Mansion had other plans. The air grew colder, and the knocking grew louder, reverberating through the walls like the heartbeat of the house itself. Each strike rattled the floor beneath me, the vibrations traveling up my legs, threatening to knock me off balance. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind spinning with panic. Thud. 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 It was coming from the east wing now, where the more sinister rumors about the mansion originated. That part of the house had been boarded up decades ago, sealed off after a series of inexplicable deaths. Malcolm Ravenwood had been obsessed with the East Wing during his final years, conducting bizarre rituals and locking himself away for days at a time. The story said that he had made a pact, something dark and ancient, that had cursed the mansion and everything in it. I didn't want to believe it, but now, standing here in the belly of this monster, it was impossible to deny. The knocking reached a crescendo, shaking the very foundation of the mansion. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for whatever came next. The shadows at the foot of the stairs still hadn't moved. They were watching me with those hollow, empty eyes, waiting for my next move. I turned in place, scanning the room for any sign of a way out. The door to the cellar loomed in the corner of the foyer, its thick wooden frame cracked and rotted. I didn't want to go down there, but it was the only option left. If the front door was no longer a viable escape, the cellar might lead to a back exit, or at least give me a place to hide. Without thinking, I dashed toward the cellar door, my heart hammering in my chest. The moment I reached it, the shadows moved. I could feel them closing in behind me, their footsteps silent but their presence overwhelming. I yanked the door open, the smell of damp earth and decay rushing up to greet me, and without hesitating, I descended into the darkness below. The cellar stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step groaning as though it might give way at any moment. My flashlight still wouldn't work, so I used my hands to guide myself along the stone walls, the cold, slick surface chilling my skin. The air down here was thick with moisture, clinging to me like a damp shroud. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint dripping of water, probably seeping through the mansion's foundation after decades of neglect. But it wasn't just water down here. There was something else. Something alive. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I sensed movement in the shadows. At first, it was just a soft scuttling sound, like rats scurrying through the cracks in the walls. But as I moved deeper into the cellar, the sound grew louder, more pronounced. It wasn't rats. The air felt different. Charged, like static before a lightning strike. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my feet sinking into the soft earth floor. The cellar was vast, much larger than I had anticipated, and it stretched out into the darkness beyond the reach of the faint light from the top of the stairs. I had the distinct feeling I wasn't supposed to be here, that I had crossed into some forbidden territory. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the cellar, illuminated by the dim glow of a flickering lantern, was a table. On it lay a series of objects, strange, twisted relics made from bones, feathers, and bits of cloth. But what caught my eye was the book. It was enormous, its leather cover cracked and worn with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. It lay open, the text scrawled in an ancient language I couldn't read. But I didn't need to understand the words to feel the power radiating from it. This was Malcolm Ravenwood's journal. The very thing that had fueled his madness. Before I could stop myself, I approached the table, my fingers itching to touch the book. The air around it seemed to hum with a dark energy, pulling me closer, whispering promises of knowledge, of answers. I knew I shouldn't, every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but the pull was too strong. I reached out and touched the brittle pages, the leather cool and slick beneath my fingers. As soon as I made contact, a violent surge of energy coursed through me, and the whispers in the walls exploded into a deafening roar. I yanked my hand back, gasping, and staggered away from the table. The shadows in the corners of the cellar seemed to shift, writhing as though they had a life of their own. And then, I heard it. A voice, clear as day, cutting through the cacophony of whispers. "He is coming." My breath hitched in my throat. The shadows began to converge, pooling together in the center of the room, taking shape, forming something monstrous, something beyond comprehension. The cellar's temperature plummeted, and the lantern flickered once before sputtering out, plunging me into complete darkness. I could feel it now, its presence. Something ancient, something terrible. Malcolm Ravenwood had summoned it, and now it wanted me. Panic surged through me. I turned to flee, but the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing me inside with whatever was coming. The whispers grew louder, angrier, filling my head with disjointed voices, none of them my own. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something hard and cold. I looked down. It was a human skull, half buried in the dirt. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as the reality of the situation sank in. I was trapped. Trapped in a mansion that was no longer just haunted, it was alive, a breathing, malevolent entity that had been waiting for someone like me. And now it had me. The darkness moved, swirling around me, tightening its grip. And in the center of it all, I felt him. Malcolm Ravenwood was still here. He had never left. And neither would I. Part 4, The Grip of Ravenwood. The oppressive darkness surrounded me, thick and alive, pressing against my skin like a suffocating shroud. The whispers had grown louder, their voices so close now, almost as if they were inside my head. They were no longer just whispers, they were screams, accusations, and commands. They demanded I stay, demanded I submit to whatever horror awaited me in the depths of Ravenwood Mansion. I tried to move, tried to force my legs to work, but it was as though the weight of the entire house was pinning me down, rooting me to the spot. The cellar felt like it was closing in on me, the walls narrowing, the air thickening with the scent of damp earth and decay. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst from my chest, and my breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps. The shadows that had pooled in the center of the cellar now writhed and twisted, forming into something tangible. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on a physical form, no longer just an absence of light but a living, breathing creature. It stretched upwards, growing taller, more defined. Long, jagged limbs extended from its body, its fingers impossibly thin and sharp, like the twisted branches of a dead tree. Where its face should have been, there was nothing, just a void of blackness, darker than the rest of the cellar, a swirling vortex that seemed to pull the very air toward it. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but my throat tightened, as though the mansion itself had reached inside me, squeezing the life out of my voice. I could feel it, Malcolm Ravenwood. His presence was everywhere, embedded in the very walls of this cursed place, and now, whatever pact he had made in life was binding me to it. I was trapped, just like him. Just like all the others. The figure moved, its elongated limbs twitching and jerking unnaturally as it began to glide toward me, silent but for the soft rustling of something slithering across the floor. My pulse quickened, the panic turning into pure, animalistic fear. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to escape before this thing, before he consumed me entirely. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced my body to move, stumbling backward until I collided with the rough stone wall of the cellar. My fingers clawed at the wall, desperate for anything, a hidden door, a crack, a way out, but the stone was cold and solid beneath my fingertips. There was no escape. The figure was closer now, its shadow stretching across the dirt floor, swallowing the feeble remnants of light that filtered down from the closed cellar door above. My skin prickled with cold, an unnatural chill that cut straight to my bones. And then I felt it, a tug, not on my body, but on my mind. A pull that I couldn't resist, a force drawing me toward the figure. I could hear the whispers more clearly now, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Join us. It's your turn. The words echoed in my skull, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if they were coming from the creature in front of me or from inside my own mind. The pull grew stronger, and against my will, I found myself stepping toward the shadow, my body no longer under my control. My legs moved as if they belonged to someone else, carrying me forward with slow, deliberate steps. No. No. I whispered, my voice barely audible, drowned out by the cacophony of voices around me. But it didn't matter. I was powerless to stop myself, powerless against the dark force that now controlled me. As I neared the figure, I felt a sudden shift in the air, like the very atmosphere had turned against me, pushing me closer to the thing that awaited me. The darkness that formed the creature's body seemed to pulse, shifting and swirling as though it was alive, as though it was feeding on my fear. The book on the table, the one I had touched, lay open, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. The symbols scrawled across the yellowed parchment glowed faintly, as if the ink itself was alive, breathing. And then I understood. This was the source. Malcolm Ravenwood's journal wasn't just a collection of his thoughts. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far older, something far darker than any spirit or ghost. Whatever Ravenwood had summoned, whatever he had bargained with, it was here now, and it was claiming me. The figure stopped just inches from me, its towering form bending and contorting as it lowered itself to my level. I could feel the icy breath of the void on my skin, a coldness so intense that it burned. The void where its face should have been swirled with movement, and for the first time, I realized that there were eyes, countless eyes, hidden within the blackness, all staring directly at me, all watching with a hunger that made my stomach twist. The voices in my head reached a crescendo, screaming at me, demanding that I give in, that I submit. I felt the pressure on my mind grow unbearable, like 1,000 hands pushing against my skull, trying to crack it open. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. The creature hovered above me, its jagged limbs curling around my body like a cage. It didn't need to physically touch me. Its presence alone was enough to keep me pinned to the ground, trapped in this nightmare. "Help," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. But there was no one. I was alone. The creature's void-like face lowered further, so close now that I could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into my very soul. And then, from deep within the swirling darkness, a voice, no longer the cacophony of whispers, but a singular voice, deep and guttural, spoke directly to me. "You are chosen." The words reverberated through me, vibrating in my bones. I didn't know what it meant, didn't want to know. But I could feel the truth in them. This was why I had been drawn here. This was why Ravenwood Mansion had called to me, why I had come despite all the warnings, all the stories. I had been chosen, marked by something far beyond my understanding. And now it was too late to turn back. The ground beneath me trembled, and the cellar walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, heavier. I could feel the mansion shifting, warping around me, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off the dark energy that swirled in the air. I gasped for breath, each inhalation a struggle as the weight of the unseen force pressed down on my chest. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like the snapping of bone, and the creature's jagged limbs recoiled, as if it had been struck. The air shifted again, and I felt a strange pressure lift, just enough for me to scramble to my feet, my limbs weak and shaking. The figure, still hovering above me, seemed to be retreating. Its form flickered, unstable, as if something had interrupted its hold over me. I didn't wait to find out what had caused the change. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my legs barely carrying me as I bolted for the cellar stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, the air rushing in and out of my lungs in ragged gasps as I scrambled up the steps, my hands gripping the cold stone walls for balance. Behind me, I heard the creature scream, a sound so inhuman, so full of rage and pain, that it sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed into the cellar door, throwing it open with a burst of desperate strength. The air hit me like a slap, cold and fresh, as I stumbled into the foyer. I had escaped the cellar. But I wasn't safe. The entire house groaned, the walls trembling as if in fury. I could hear the footsteps again, those heavy, deliberate steps, and they were coming from every direction. The shadows that had once been confined to the staircase were now crawling along the walls, spilling into the room like black ink, closing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. Now. I bolted for the front door, my hands fumbling with the latch. The door resisted at first, as if the house itself was fighting to keep me inside, but I pulled harder, my desperation lending me strength. With a final, guttural scream, I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night. Cold air rushed around me, and the suffocating darkness of the mansion was replaced by the soft glow of the moon. I fell to my knees on the gravel pathway, my body shaking uncontrollably as the weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I had made it out. But Ravenwood wasn't done with me yet. From behind me, deep inside the mansion, I heard it, the sound of the door slamming shut, followed by the rhythmic, deliberate knocking that had haunted me in the cellar. Thud. 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 The mansion was calling. It was waiting. And I knew, even as I gasped for breath under the night sky, that I had only just begun to understand what it wanted from me. The pact wasn't over. It had only just begun. Part 5, The Pact Sealed. The cold air outside Ravenwood Mansion did little to calm the storm inside me. I crouched on the gravel path, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I had escaped, but the chill in my bones told me that I hadn't truly left. The mansion was still watching, still waiting. The rhythmic knocking, thud, 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 echoed from behind the heavy doors, resonating in my skull like a heartbeat. It had followed me, the sound reverberating in the stillness of the night, a reminder that I was tethered to the house in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. I should have run. Any sane person would have sprinted away from the cursed mansion and never looked back. But I couldn't. My body was still trembling, my limbs heavy, but something stronger, something deeper, rooted me to the spot. I had come for answers, hadn't I? My mind was screaming at me to leave, to disappear into the night and never return. Yet my body, controlled by something far darker, remained frozen. The wind rustled through the skeletal trees, and I stood, my breath visible in the cold air. The mansion loomed behind me, a silhouette of malevolence, but something drew my gaze upward. A flicker of movement in the second-floor window, the one directly above the foyer, caught my eye. The curtains, yellowed with age and neglect, stirred, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A face. It was only a fleeting glimpse, but I knew it immediately. Malcolm Ravenwood. His gaunt, pale features stared down at me from the window, his eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, tracking my every move. There was no mistaking him. The man who had made the mansion his tomb. The man who had struck a deal with something far worse than death. My heart thundered in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. Malcolm's face remained eerily still, but there was something in his gaze, something that told me he wasn't finished with me. Not yet. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, his mouth moved, and I heard it, clearly, impossibly, as though he were standing right next to me. Come back. The words were a command, not a plea. Every fiber of my being screamed in defiance, but there was no denying the pull I felt. The dark thread that had been wrapped around me since the moment I stepped into Ravenwood Mansion tightened, yanking me back toward the house like a marionette. The shadows that crawled inside the mansion had seeped into my very soul, and now, even out in the cold, I could feel them tugging me closer. Before I could stop myself, my legs were moving, carrying me back toward the front door. The gravel crunched under my feet, louder than before, like the very earth was urging me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was as though my body was no longer my own, the mansion's dark will overriding my mind, guiding me like a puppet. The knocking continued as I reached the door, thud, 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 slow, deliberate, as if the house itself was counting down the moments until I returned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, every nerve in my body on edge. This was it. This was the moment I had dreaded since the moment I stepped onto the grounds. I pushed the door open. The cold, decaying air hit me like a wall, the darkness inside seeming to pulse with life. The foyer was just as I had left it, but something was different. The shadows seemed thicker, more solid, and the whispers that had once been distant murmurs now pressed against my ears, louder, more urgent. They weren't just voices anymore, they were accusations, threats, promises of doom. You belong to him. He's waiting. You can't leave. I stepped inside, my legs moving of their own accord, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I jumped, spinning around, but the door was sealed, its heavy wooden frame warping and groaning as though it were part of the living, breathing house itself. The sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase, slow and measured, just like before. My heart pounded as I turned back toward the grand staircase, and there, at the top, stood the figure of Malcolm Ravenwood, no longer a ghostly apparition but solid, real. He was draped in black, his clothes worn and tattered, as if he had stepped out of his own funeral. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those terrible, hollow eyes, bored into mine with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. He began to descend the staircase, his movements slow and deliberate, each step a mockery of life. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was rooted to the spot, frozen by the sheer malevolence of his presence. "You've come," Malcolm said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to scrape against the walls. "I knew you would." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "What do you want from me?" His lips twisted into a smile, a cruel, knowing smile that made my blood run cold. What was promised? Promised? My mind raced, struggling to understand. I had never made any promises, never agreed to anything. But then it hit me, this wasn't about me. This was about the pact, the deal Malcolm had struck all those years ago. A deal that bound him, his soul, and the mansion to something far worse than death. You came here willingly, Malcolm continued, his voice dripping with dark satisfaction. The house called, and you answered. Now you're part of the pact. Just like the others. Others. My chest tightened as the realization dawned on me. The shadows, the whispers, they weren't just remnants of the past. They were the souls of those who had come before me, those who had been lured into the mansion and consumed by its darkness. They were trapped here, just as I was. No, I whispered, my voice shaking. I didn't agree to this. Malcolm's eyes gleamed with a twisted amusement. It doesn't matter. The pact was made long before you were born. You're simply fulfilling your part. I stumbled backward, the weight of his words crushing down on me. This was why I had been drawn here, why I had felt the pull of the mansion for so long. It wasn't chance, it was fate, a dark, twisted fate that had been sealed long before I even knew of Ravenwood Mansion. The shadows around me shifted, swirling like a storm, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel the weight of countless eyes watching me from every corner of the room, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I don't want this, I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. I don't want to be part of this. Malcolm's smile widened, and he took another step toward me. It's too late. You've already crossed the threshold. The house has claimed you. Panic surged through me, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows had closed in, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The whispers were inside my head now, echoing through my mind like a chorus of the damned. Then, from the depths of the mansion, a new sound emerged, laughter. A low, guttural laugh, so full of malice and cruelty that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't Malcolm's voice. It was something else. Something older. Something ancient. The air grew colder, and the very walls of the mansion seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The floor beneath my feet trembled, and I could feel it, the presence. The thing that Malcolm had summoned, the thing that had trapped him here, that had consumed the souls of everyone who had crossed its path. And now, it wanted me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Please, I begged, my voice barely a whisper. Please, let me go. Malcolm's eyes glittered with cold amusement. There's no escape. You belong to the house now. Just like I do. His form began to flicker, the edges of his body dissolving into the shadows as he merged with the darkness around him. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, and the air thickened with the scent of rot and decay. I could feel the presence closing in, pressing against my skin, wrapping around my throat. The shadows were suffocating me, choking the life out of me as the darkness consumed everything. And then, through the swirling blackness, a single thought pierced through the chaos. The book. The journal, Malcolm's journal. The one in the cellar, the one that had radiated such dark power. It was the key. I didn't know how I knew, but I was certain. The pact was written in that book, bound to its pages by the twisted magic Malcolm had used to summon this nightmare. If I could destroy it, maybe I could break the pact. Maybe I could free myself. With a surge of desperation, I tore myself from the grip of the shadows and bolted for the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. The house groaned in fury, the walls trembling as the darkness lashed out at me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I raced through the hallway, the mansion warping around me, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The shadows clawed at my ankles, trying to pull me down, but I pushed forward, fueled by sheer terror. I reached the cellar door, throwing it open and plunging into the darkness below. The steps groaned under my weight, and I stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught myself just in time. The air was thick with rot, and I could feel the presence closing in on me, a malevolent force that was growing stronger with every passing second. There, on the table, was the journal. I lunged for it, my fingers trembling as I gripped the brittle pages. The moment I touched it, the air exploded with a deafening roar, the house shaking violently as if it were trying to tear itself apart. The shadows screamed, the voices shrieking in rage. But I didn't stop. With a scream of desperation, I tore the book in half. The darkness recoiled, the presence shrieking in agony. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath my feet buckled as the house seemed to collapse in on itself. I was thrown to the ground, my vision blurring as the world around me disintegrated into chaos. And then, everything went still. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. Slowly, I forced myself to my feet, my heart still racing in my chest. The mansion was silent. Cold. Dead. I had broken the pact. But as I staggered toward the stairs, the darkness that lingered in the corners of the cellar whispered one final truth. Ravenwood had let me go. But it wasn't over. It would never be over.